Okay.
That's fine. Oh, okay.
Okay.
All right. So welcome everybody. And as you can see, next month on April 18th, we will have a members only. That means the Jewish Genealogical Society of New York members only. A virtual tour of the new exhibition of the new Anu Museum of the Jewish People, which formally opened just the past month or so, and founded 42 years ago as the Museum of the Diaspora, Beit HaTfutzot, which some of you may know as by that name, has been totally transformed, tripled its space, making it the largest Jewish museum in the world. We will learn about the new exhibits and hear about the museum's genealogy database. So, and that will be in the form of a Zoom meeting, and you members will be receiving emails about that in a few weeks. On May 23rd, I want to emphasize that the April 18th meeting will begin at 1 o'clock, 1 p.m., not Eastern time, not 2 p.m. So that will be in the future notices. But on May 23rd, we're back to the 2 p.m. start. And Marion Smith, who was the longtime historian for the Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS, later the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS, will speak on researching U.S. citizenship and immigration services records. Her talk will provide an overview of 3 historical eras from 1820 to the present, and will be illustrated with documents of Jewish immigrants. So I urge you to attend. Now for today, today's speaker, Jennie Milne, was born in Greenwich, London, and currently lives in Northeast Scotland, from where she is speaking to us today. She holds a master's degree in communication design in photography from Robert Gordon University in Aberdeen, where she is currently employed in the art school. After her mother's passing in 2014, Jennie began her search for her grandparents and her extraordinary journey to uncover her mother's mysterious background. A freelance professional photographer, Jennie has exhibited her work relating to her own family search with survivors and descendants of those impacted by World War II and victims of terrorism in Israel. She presented her family she presented her family story at the 2018 IAJGS conference in Warsaw. We will now hear from Jennie about her path to uncover her forgotten heritage. Thank you, Jennie.
Thank you very much, Joy. Let me share my screen. Okay. Make sure I get the correct screen. Okay. I just need to go back a slide. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining. Thank you to the Jewish Genealogical Society of New York for inviting me to speak, especially to Joy. And thank you also to Karen Franklin for encouraging me to do so. So good, I guess it's good afternoon, New York. Good morning to the West Side, the West Coast, I should say, not the West Side of America. And good evening everywhere else in the world. So today I just would like to share with you how I managed to uncover my grandparents' story, my mum's heritage, which we didn't know anything about when we were growing up, really. I've called it Fragments That Remain because really I've put this story together just from fragments of information. We were a broken family, broken by World War II, but I didn't realize it growing up. I just thought I was part of a broken family. Now, to start with, I want to read a quote by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a German pastor during World War II, and he actually lost his life. He was executed for the stand that he took. He said, "There is meaning in every journey that is unknown to the traveler." And when I first embarked on this journey, I had no idea of the meaning, the rich meaning that I would come to understand as I traveled along. I also want to say that this has been a very personal journey for me. It's come from a desire that I had, that I needed to make a connection with my mom. But although it's a journey that I've taken on my own in many ways, I've done so much of the research and things myself. It's not a journey that I've taken completely alone. I've had some expert advice and help from some really incredible people. And there's too many people really to name, but I would like to thank Robert Ostrichart, Michael Tobias, Janusz Rahl, and Hillel Cutler in particular for the time and input that they've had in this journey. So it began for me with a question, who am I? And here I am, you know, this is a taste of the future, though nobody knew it at the time. My father took this picture of me in 1968 or 69. I'm tending to some very battered baby dolls. Nobody thought that I was maternal. I didn't think I was maternal. But if you look on the left-hand side of the picture, you know, later in life, I got to look after my real life baby dolls, 9 of them, and they're there with my husband, Brian. So for me, this is about family, the importance of family. Now, every story, you know, begins with a relationship, usually. This is a genealogical society. And for me, genealogy is not just the dry history, it's relationships. It's, you know, my relationship to my parents and my grandparents and on back. But the only relationship that I really had was a relationship with my mom that was very difficult and quite broken. And it was this particular relationship that this whole search has stemmed from, or a desire actually to know and understand my mom, because I never really achieved that throughout my childhood and even through my adult life. The picture on the left shows my mom holding my hand while she's walking down a little lane in a village in Devon. It was a village that she was taken to as a newborn baby and left by her Polish mom until the end of the war. She was taken to a wartime babies home because her mother said that she couldn't look after her, but she would return for her after the war. And I'm holding my mom's hand, so there is some kind of connection in this image. But the following image was taken in 2010, I think, or 2011. Many years had gone between that. And, you know, I'm still wanting to get to know my mom. Now, what I can tell you about Mom was that she was born in London in November 1943, in the middle of the war. And she told me growing up, and all my siblings, that her Polish mom had left her in a home for officers' children, and she'd never returned at the end of the war. Here she is. This is the earliest photograph, I think, that exists of Mom. She looks about 12 months old. And she said that she was just another baby in the baby's home. There was no significant adult that was there just for her. And she felt that. I think she really felt that quite deeply, but I didn't understand that for many years. She told me that when the war ended, all the other children were returned to their parents, but she was left behind like a left luggage parcel. You know, my mom was fearless throughout her life. She was a very strong character. And you can see this in this little girl sitting on this lion. Mom seemed to be able to tackle anything. But underneath, I think she was quite vulnerable and she just hid it very well. So the matron of the baby's home that her mother handed her to was a lady named Rose Toms. She was a qualified children's nurse. She was running a children's home before the war, but it was acquisitioned by Britain's wartime government for children, I think, that were evacuated and needed to be away from their parents. Well, when all the other children were picked up at the end of the war and Mum was left behind, Rose, who was an orphan herself, her parents had died when she was very young. She never married. Her fiance was killed in the First World War. She decided that she would raise this little girl as her own daughter. So Mum, who was born Elizabeth Mary Lis, became Elizabeth Mary Lister. Rose decided to change her name to help her feel more assimilated. Now, when I was growing up as a child, Mum had 7 children. She had a big family as well. She was wanting to create this family that she didn't have. And she had lots of photographs on the wall. She called it the Rogues Gallery. And if any of my siblings will listen to this, they'll identify with that. It was full of photographs of her children and lots of people I think we probably didn't even know who they were. She was quite similar to me because my walls are the same. But in amongst these pictures was there a tiny passport-sized photograph of this man. He looked very stern, and I somehow knew that it was her father. But because Mum didn't seem to have anybody in her life, it made no sense to me, and I didn't really pay much attention to it. Many years later, she sent me this photograph. I think she thought I was the family historian or custodian, and so she passed it into my care. And when I turned it over, I saw in her writing she'd written Papa around 1963. And I was to find out in 1999 when I started asking Mum about her family. She'd actually met her father in London. She traced him in her early 20s, and her mother too. But they'd lost contact through no fault of their own, all of them, very quickly. So in 2014, when my mum died, this was her family tree. I'd been trying to build a tree for my father's family, but I could go no further than this with Mum. We knew that her father was this man, Ellen Lis, and her mother, I discovered in 1999, was called Helena, and that she'd met her mother and she thought she might be Jewish. They were both divorced and remarried, and Stanisław's second wife, also named Helena, had told Mum that she knew her birth mother in Poland and that she came from a half Jewish family that were pretending to be aristocratic. That's what she said. Now, just as a little anecdote here, Stanisław seemed to like the name Helena. His mother was named Helena, his sister was named Helena, his first wife was named Helena, and his second wife was named Helena. So there were a few Helena Lises to sort out. Now, I also experienced loss growing up, and I think that my desire to search for Mum's family came from a deep sense of loss myself. The loss of a mother who was unable to connect to her children, really, and the loss of my father, who died when I was 10 years old in 1978. You can see him on the left-hand side of the picture. My father was much older than my mum, about 32 years older. And they met in the early 60s when my mum was in her early 20s. I think she was looking for a father figure, to be honest. But my father died suddenly. And that night, the night my father died, he was an organist, and he died at the organ in church with my sister and myself present. My mum had already left. She was living with somebody else and my two younger siblings, sorry. That night we never went home. I never went back to my school. I never saw my friends again. We were moved that night. We were uprooted to another house, a strange house with a strange new father. And I think months later in my new classroom in this new school, I was learning about the Holocaust, and I saw this photograph of this little boy on the desk. And I was so moved by this photo. I identified with this frightened little child that we know is the famous photograph taken in the Warsaw Ghetto. It's called Forced Out of the Bunkers. And I think something in the fear and insecurity in that little boy's face I identified with. But I had no idea that I had a connection to the Warsaw Ghetto, a very direct connection, actually. But this image has stayed with me all my life. There I am, as a 10-year-old child. Now, because of the difficulties that I went through as a child, I didn't really have an interest in Mum's background. You know, I didn't want to know. I just wanted to live in the present and try and make sense of our lives. But, you know, time changes things. And over a period of years, I got to a place where I was actually ready to listen. And the thing that triggered it was my youngest daughter, Faith, seen here on the left, started to do a project on World War II at school. Now, I didn't have as many children at home by the time Faith started this project, and I thought I want to help her. And I knew that my mum had a story which I'd heard was, quite unusual, or anyway, it would be a good story for the children to learn at school. So I phoned my mum and I asked her if she could tell me everything she knew about her background. Well, one thing that she told me was that her mother had falsified her birth certificate. She told her that when she met her in the 60s. And she said, I don't even know, Jen, if my date of birth is right. And I said, do you know if you're Jewish, Mum? You've always believed you're Jewish. And she said, I really don't know. She said, I don't know if any of it's true. Now, Simone Weil wrote during the Second World War, to be rooted is perhaps the most important and least recognized need of the human soul. What I didn't understand was that my mum had no roots, and and it wasn't recognized. Certainly when she was a little girl, she was brought up to be grateful for the fact that somebody had taken her in and taken care of her. She was told that her father had been killed during the war and her mum didn't want her. But what mum told me in that first conversation was she simply felt she didn't belong anywhere. And she never lost that sense of displacement throughout her whole life. About a year after I had that first conversation with mum, and I told her, Mum, I'm going to try and find your family for you. I think for the first time I realized she had this gaping hole in her life and I wanted to help her fill it. But sadly, a year later, she died. And I went down to Devon, where she was living, to meet my family. These are all my siblings in age order, or my mum's children. Actually, this was the last time we were ever together. And I went into a coffee shop before I went to my mum's husband's home. And this was the front page of the newspaper, excuse me, tributes paid to long-serving town councillor Lis Tirard. Mum might not have been able to connect to her children, but she certainly was well known in the community and she did a lot of work within the community that she lived. She had a finger in every pie, we would say. And we got lots and lots of letters from people from all over the place writing to us and saying what a difference she'd made in their lives. My sister Bex gave a eulogy at Mum's funeral. And actually, I think this really sums up how I felt and how we all felt. She was an enigma to her very last breath. Mum had a mystery about her. She kept a lot of secrets from us, but I realized she had a lot of secrets that had been kept from her. Bex goes on to say it's fair to say that for many, if not all her children, our lives to date have been defined by a constant battle to understand who she was in relation to us. In this, she was an enigma to her very last breath. As I stood before Mum's coffin, because I read a poem, we pre-agreed that I would read a poem. I said to the man who stood at the gate of the year, was the poem I read, if any of you are familiar with it. And I looked at this coffin, my hand brushed it as I walked past, and I realized, reflecting later on, that I was still looking for that connection. And I knew this woman so well. As a child, I'd known how to anticipate her every move. I lived on tenterhooks, and I was so aware of all my mum's moods and emotions. I could read her like a book. But as I stood before her coffin, I knew I didn't know who she was at all. I had no idea really where she'd come from or who she was. And then later on, I realized that neither did she. When Mum met her parents, she kept a series of handwritten notes, these 4 pages, double-sided, with all the information that she could remember on their pages. Well, I came home and went back up to the northeast of Scotland. It's a long way to Devon. And over the next few months, I kept thinking about this, and I kept thinking I needed to find out who her parents were. I needed to know why Mum was the way she was. I needed to have some context to my life, to her life. It says in Ecclesiastes, there's a time to search, and I felt that it was a time to search. When my sister and my mum's husband went to register her death, they phoned me and said, what name should we put on the death certificate? You see, my mum had many names. She was born Elizabeth Lis. She became Elizabeth Lister. She then became Elizabeth Workman, Bellingham, Tirard, Tirard Button. And finally, Elizabeth Boville, her fifth husband, Mike, looked after her until her death. And he was the one that registered her death with my sister. So one morning I woke up in March, the same year, 2014, knowing that I had to search for her family. And the first thing I did was I prayed. It says in the book of Daniel that there's a God in heaven who can reveal secrets. And I thought, you know, the only way I'm going to find out what happened to Mum's family is maybe if God could reveal it to me, because surely he knows everything. So I prayed and I asked him to help me. And then I went downstairs and made breakfast for my kids, sat down in my big armchair and decided to start working out how to do this. I started with these pages that Mum had written. So I had a page for my grandfather, actually maybe a couple of pages for my grandfather and a page for my grandmother. Well, looking at my grandmother's details, there was no way I was going to find her from the things that Mum knew. We only knew her name was Helena Lis, and we didn't even know if that was correct. But my grandfather, I knew, had been the international secretary of the Polish Ex-Combatants Association. Mum had told me that he was in the Polish government in exile. So I thought surely somebody there would know who he is. So just before I phoned them, I wrote to Who Do You Think You Are, the television program. I'd got the address from one of their magazines, asked them if they could help me. And then I found the number for the SPK, the Polish ex-combatants. And I spoke to a little old lady, well, I don't know if she was little actually, but she was in her 50s. She'd been there, sorry, she wasn't in her 50s. I'm in my 50s, I'm not a little old lady. But anyway, she told me she'd worked there since the 50s and she knew who my grandfather was. That was emotional for both of us, I can tell you. It was just hours after I decided I was going to try and find out. And she said, I can't believe that I'm talking to the granddaughter of someone who was so famous. And that completely took me by surprise, because I had no idea that my grandfather was so well known in the Polish community, or the Polish emigre, the exiled Polish community, I should say. So this lovely lady, you know, I could tell from the sadness in her voice, the struggle that it had been for these people that were exiled from their country, from their home. But she told me to phone the Ministry of Defence, the Polish section in Northolt in England. They would have my grandfather's records. So this would prove to be the way to discover my grandparents' identity. I phoned the Ministry of Defence, and within 5 or 10 minutes, the lady on the other end had found my grandfather's military records. She said there were about 13 Stanisław Lis, only one was an officer. And she knew that was my grandfather because I told her he had 2 degrees, one from Warsaw University, which was in law, and the other I thought was from Krakow, but it was actually from Lvov. So she told me to send £30 and wait, and she would put the records together over, you know, I would get them in about 3 months. Well, a couple of days later, I realized maybe she would have my grandmother's records too, because she told my mum she was in the Polish army too. And that's why she gave her up. She said she was desperate to continue fighting for her country. And she was just frantic when she found out that Mum was on the way. So sure enough, they had the records for Helena Lis, the only Helena Lis, actually. They confirmed they were her records with my grandfather's records. And 3 months later, and you have to wait for all these things. 3 months later, these records came through the door. And this was the first image I'd ever seen of my grandmother. And I knew immediately she was my mum's mum. I could just see it in her face. So this lady that I didn't know whether she was Jewish or not said that she was Roman Catholic. She said that she was born in Stry in Stanisław. I didn't know where that was. And she had been born on the 8th of May, 1907. And she also stated, yes, she was a Roman Catholic. Well, what do you do when you see the first picture you've ever seen of your grandmother? You immediately compare her to your mother. And here she is next to my mom. And I think you can see that there's a likeness. I noticed it straight away in their eyebrows. So we learned from these records that her parents were called Pavel and Francesca née Probst. Now, she never said what her father's name was. He was only known or identified as Pavel. She was married to Stanisław Lis, but her mother she called Francesca Probst. Now, my grandfather, Stanisław, he actually revealed more information. They said that he was much less reticent than Helena. She only gave information that she absolutely had to give. But he said that he was married to Helena Rottenberg Solomrecka. So that's when I first heard those names, that was her maiden name, Rottenberg. Solomrecka, I didn't know where that came from. And taking a closer look at his record, where he said that he was married to Helena Rottenberg, somebody had added information, this name Kosden. They'd added Solomrecka and Helena Teresa Maria Anna, all those four as first names. I think, well, my immediate reaction was she's trying to make a point here that she's really a Catholic. But anyways, yeah, that's the first glimpse of all Helena's identities. So I looked up the name Solomrecka, and I found that there were only noble families named Solomrecka back in the 1600s. I could only find one other person named Solomrecka. It was a lady. She lived in America, or she'd gone to America. Her name was Irena. And, you know, that was the only person I could find. So I thought the two must be connected. This is the coat of arms for Solomrecka. Well, some of you watching will certainly recognize this face. When I wrote to Who Do You Think You Are, they told me they couldn't help me. But about 4 months later, in August, I got another letter from them saying their Jewish expert had had a look at my letter or found my letter, and he wanted to help me, thought he could help me. This, of course, is Michael Tobias. So wait for the slide to load with all my grandmother's names. So this is where we began to unlock my grandmother's identity. Michael, of course, was an expert in Jewish genealogy. So my grandmother had all these names: Malia Rottenberg, Helena, Kosden, Kolomerecki, Solomrecka, Lis, Konopka. I think you could say like mother, like daughter. So that same day, Michael found Helena's records in the Jewish registry in Stree, and he wrote to me and he said Helena was fully Jewish. He found two records for what he thought were Helena's two sisters, Malia and Rosa. One was born in 1900, the other was born in 1902. The father was Pinchas Rothenberg, and Michael explained to me that Pavel would have been, his Hebrew name was Pinchas, and Francesca Probst, her Hebrew name was Fegidwora, that they would use other more assimilated names, but that were very similar to, you know, began with the same initial of their Hebrew names. So he then made a statement that I didn't realize was actually going to turn my life upside down. But he said, "You do realize this makes you Jewish?" Well, we'd always wondered. And I remembered saying, I got in touch with my siblings and I said, you know, we're Jewish. And because we'd all had our names changed, every time my mum met another man, she changed her children's names. Mine was only changed once, but some of my younger siblings had a few more changes of names. And my brother Peter, who's a pastor, said, "Well, Jen, you can't get much more rooted than Abraham." So that was his response. Well, I had a look at the records that Michael sent me, and I noticed that Malia Rothenberg had been born on the 8th of May. And I thought, well, so had Helena been born on the 8th of May. And then I also noticed that, that Rosa Rothenberg had been born on the 14th of August. And this woman that I had found, this Solomrecka, was also born on the 14th of August. So I thought, well, surely they must be the same girls. So this was the first tree that we managed to put together with just a few months really of searching for Mum's family. My grandmother, we found now, was Helena Solomrecka, known as Helena Solomrecka. She was born Malia Rothenberg, and her sister was Rosa Rothenberg, and their parents were Pinchas Rothenberg and Fegidwora Probst. Just last year, during lockdown, my cousin found this photograph in a box in her home. And we believe that it's Fegi Dwara Probst with her daughters Rosa and Helena, or Irena and Rosa and Malia, sorry, or I'm getting confused. I'm confusing myself. Irena and Helena, or Rosa and Malia. Michael also put together a tree of the Probsts, Fegi Dwara's family, for me. And he sent me this photograph he found on Yad Vashem of one of Helena's cousins. This is Reuben Probst, and was probably the first photograph I'd seen of any extended family. And I'll tell you a bit more about Reuben Probst later. So here we go. Here's the Baroness who started life as Malia Rothenberg. So once I knew her identity, that she really was Jewish, I still didn't know how to find her because she'd divorced my grandfather. So I started searching using the names Helena, Anna, Maria Teresa, no, Helena, Teresa, Maria, Anna. And up came this record for her marriage to Baron Jan Konopka. Now, Mum had been told by Helena that she was married to General Anders' bodyguard, or wartime bodyguard, she was told. I actually found out by contacting General Anders' daughter that Baron Jan Konopka was his adjutant in London. Now, what's really amusing about this is you remember that Helena was really born in 1902, but she kept losing years off her age. And in 1951, when she married Jan Konopka, who was 38, she surprisingly was also 38. In reality, she was 49. So that led me to find her death certificate. And sadly, Helena had died very close to where I was living in Yorkshire for a number of years in the early 1990s. In fact, my grandmother lived just 15 minutes from my door for about 4 years. She lived in a Polish nursing home in Castlethorpe, and I phoned the home immediately, and this lovely nurse answered the phone. She said, "I'm the only person in this whole home who would remember Helena." She said, "But I nursed her, I looked after her. I remember the day that she was admitted." She loved her. She said she was just such a lovely person. She spoke perfect English, but she thought she owned the place. She would go into the kitchen at night and say, "Could you turn the lights off, please? I'm paying the bills." She suffered from dementia, but she thought all the nurses were her servants. But anyway, sadly, Helena died aged 98 in the year 2000. And the year on her death certificate is 1913. She certainly knew how to lose those years. But you would never have traced Baroness Helena Konopka, née Solomorecka. You would never have traced Malia Rothenberg from that identity. So Michael encouraged me to look for her last will and testament in the Royal Courts of Justice. And it was in this document where Helena named her nephew as her beneficiary. Now, when Helena met my mum, she told her that she had a nephew who'd been so badly beaten by the Nazis, age 14, he'd almost died. I'd known that all the time growing up. Mum told me this, and that he'd gone to America, she said, for reconstructive surgery. And I wondered, if this was the same nephew that Mum had talked about that was named in her will. So this was the trail that was to lead me to find living family, which was what I really, really wanted to do. So just a visual for you here, you can see the two sisters and Irena's son, Władimier's, I can't pronounce it, James. He adopted the name James Rosotsky, born in Warsaw in 1929. So I wrote to a friend in America and asked if she could find me anything out about James Rosotsky, and she sent me his obituary. Very sadly, he died many years before, but he left two daughters named Renata and Sandy. So I messaged them both on Facebook and, kept checking my phone for a response. And after they didn't respond, within a few minutes, I became a private detective. I later found out that James was a private detective, so I was keeping it in the family. And I tracked Renata down. I tracked her phone number down, and I phoned her one Sunday. And Renata's, I believe she's listening, she'll remember this. I phoned her up and I said, Renata, is this Renata? Do you have an aunt named Helena? And she said, yes. Was your dad called James? Yes. I found Helena's family. And Renata said to me, you've got to talk to my sister, Sandy. So here we are. Here's the new family tree with second cousins. And I also spoke to Sandy, and she said to me, when she heard, she burst into tears. She'd felt that she was Jewish all her life, but they didn't think their father ever knew that he was. Well, immediately we began corresponding, and across the Atlantic came these pictures of family pictures of my grandmother, of Helena, of my mother's mother. These were just wonderful to receive. So a little bit about James, my grandmother's nephew. She was very close to him. She loved him dearly. Well, James left memoirs for his daughters, and they pieced together and confirmed a lot of the information that we'd already discovered. Pincus, for example, it said on the birth certificate, was the manager of a sawmill, and James remembers that. But he also mentions he spent time with his aunt Helena and her husband. She was my mother's sister, and her husband was a senator. My maternal grandfather owned an estate and a lumber mill in the same part of Poland as we did, he said. And he said that he really respected his grandfather. He never knew that he was Jewish. His grandfather was Jewish. He did know that he drank vodka at the beginning of the day. And James tried a shot when nobody was looking when he was a little boy, and he said it burned all the way down. He swore he'd never do it again. Now, James wrote about his memories of being in Warsaw at the beginning of World War II. He was just a 10-year-old boy. He wrote down many of his memories. He lived in this apartment block. He dug trenches outside of it when the Germans first invaded. He joined the underground as a 12-year-old boy. He used to go into restaurants, cloakrooms, and look for weapons. He found most of them in Hungarian soldiers' coats. He said they seemed to leave them in there. Another thing he said he did was he would put notices on lampposts that said, reserved for hanging Germans. Of course, he was risking his life in doing that. But probably one of the most significant things that James did was one day he found a little Jewish boy living in doorways on their street. He said he was starving and dressed in rags. He was about 7. He'd escaped from the Warsaw ghetto, and James took him home. And Irena and James washed him and looked after him. And through many of these memories, James says, as he writes this, he wrote it for his daughters. He says, my eyes are sweating. Now, they hid this little boy, Moshe, for about 7 months before they were, before the Germans raided them, or they were betrayed, or they found out. I don't believe that they realized they were hiding a Jewish child, because they would have been shot. But they were just definitely arrested. We don't know what happened to Moshe. James said he never found out. Irena and James were both arrested and taken to the Gestapo headquarters in Warsaw, where James was beaten up severely. He said 3 Gestapo agents worked on him. And just like my grandmother had told my mom, it was another prisoner that saved his life. He would have died if he'd not sat him up. So James was taken to a concentration camp. We believe it was Mauthausen. It was in Austria. It was a slave labor camp. The Germans didn't know that he was Jewish. And James was there from 1943 until he escaped, unbelievably, in the winter of 1944. And he made a journey across Italy with his friend, and they eventually joined the British troops, I think also the American troops, and they fought. And I remember him, well, I've written down his journey. I haven't included it in this, so that's another story for another time. But after the war was over, after they were liberated, this is a photo also that Sandy sent me last year. Here's James. He's only 14 or 15 years old. After 7 years of Nazi hell in UNRWA's heaven, he survived. Well, James and his mum both came to Britain, and they stayed in Britain until 1951. They went to Helena's wedding to Jan Konopka, and then within a few days they were on the Queen Elizabeth to New York. Can you believe it? I was speaking to New York today, and that's where they came, they emigrated to, and there is the ship's manifest. Well, James, you know, he never lost the skills that he learned in the underground. He fought in the Korean War. His daughters believe that he was involved in interrogations, and also in the Air Force, they believe he was a spy, but they found out that he had a Purple Heart at his funeral, I believe. He didn't tell them that. So he was in the CIA. He was an incredible guy from all that I've learned, and I wish I'd known him. And actually, just his character was so similar to my mum's. It's unbelievable. So this is Helena's sister, James's mum, the Countess. How did she become a countess? Well, we don't know. We just know that these girls, these two Jewish girls, were very good at climbing socially, and Irena ended up marrying Zygmunt Rosotsky, Count Zygmunt Rosotsky. The marriage certificate was just found right before lockdown, and again, there's all the information that we would expect on it. She was born in Stri, the daughter of Pavel. Again, she's not said his surname, but Francesca named Probert. This is the church that she married in, and the Zadora coat of arms. She kept lots of secrets from her son, from her family, and, you know, maybe in the society that she mixed in. This man, Thomas Lechensky, I can't pronounce his surname. I'm so sorry, Thomas. He wrote a book about the Rosotskis, because they're a noble Polish family. And there's a note next to Irena. It says her real name was Irena Rothenberg. Her father was a Jew and a wood trader in Stri. Actually, one of Sandy's cousins told me that she was known in the family as Aunt Rosa, and he didn't know why. Obviously, it was because that was her real name. So we know that Irena was in the resistance for many years. She spoke fluent German. The Germans offered her to sign a Volksdeutsch. She refused. We don't really know what she did, though. When they were both arrested by the Gestapo, she told James that she'd been in Dachau at the end of the war, but actually it turns out that she wasn't in Dachau. The Red Cross, I found information from them. She was in Vienna just about a week after her arrest. And a friend of mine who's a historian told me that she was living within a short time right across from the Gestapo headquarters in Vienna, and we think she was hiding in plain sight. We don't know what she's doing, and I still have a lot of work to do on her story. So James traced his mum at the end of the war in Vienna through the Red Cross, and he says the reunion with my mother was beyond words, but they never spoke about the time from their arrest until liberation, ever in their lives. It was just never talked about. Now, one thing that Irena didn't tell her son or her family was that she had a brother, but Helena did tell my mum that she had a brother. It's recorded in my mum's notes. She said he was executed by firing squad in Poland in the war. Now, the only evidence we have of her brother was a record that Mark Halpern found for Henrik Rothenberg, who was 10 years younger than Helena, born in March 1912. That's all we know about him. I've never been able to trace anything else. We know he was murdered in the Holocaust, and there's the family. So moving on to the next chapter, that was my immediate family, my grandmother's immediate family, and we're in touch regularly, and it's just wonderful to have recovered them. But we wanted to find out the rest of the Rothenberg family. Who was Helena's father? We couldn't find out. For 3 years, people were looking, people in Poland, people in the UK. Michael was helping me. We just couldn't find any information. But do you remember that name Cosden that was on those records? Well, it turns out that Helena's first marriage, which my mum had known that she apparently had been married and divorced by the age of 18, was to a guy called Gustav Cosden. And this record was found of this marriage. Now, he wasn't Jewish, So in order to marry him in this church, Helena needed to convert. So Macikolski, my Polish researcher, found this conversion record in the Lvov. And it says, you know, the same information, except she's already pretending to be 5 years younger than she really is. On 18th of October 1926, she renounced the Jewish faith. But in order to get her baptism certificate, which we hoped would give us her grandparents' names, I had to prove that I was her granddaughter. You can imagine how challenging that was. So I was able to do that, and we started waiting for this baptism record. Well, a lot can change in a morning. If you have a look at this date, the 7th of June, you'll see what I mean. So on the 7th of June, 2017, at 5 to 9 in the morning, I received this certificate from Maci. He says, "Here is your precious document, Jenny." And it was her baptism certificate, and it named her grandparents. So we knew that the Probs, her mother's parents, were called Gershon and Frimet. Now they were named on this document as George and Felicia. And Pavel, or Paul on here, his parents were named as Zanassis and Rosilia. So I messaged Michael and I says, "Michael, we're looking for grandparents whose names begin with Z and R." I then went and checked my autosomal DNA, which I'd uploaded to Family Tree DNA sometime before. I'd been checking to see if it had been processed. And this morning, of all mornings, it had. On the top of the list was a Rothenberg match. And you can see, you know, just a short time later, 9:42, Karen Franklin managed this match. So I messaged Karen. I didn't know Karen, obviously, at the time. And I said that I was looking for a Pincus Rothenberg. Well, her client had a tree, a lovely tree that Karen had built. Pincus Rothenberg was in that tree. He was the brother of her client's grandfather. So Pincus' brother was Leo Rothenberg, and his son was Emil, and his grandson was Alan Rothenberg, who lives in San Francisco. So the same day, we put together another level of the family tree. So there's Zindel and Riva, that was the Z and the R, and their sons, Leo and Pincus, and then my grandmother's first cousin, Emil, and my mum's first cousin, Alan. And Alan had an aunt called Ada, and she'd also written a letter in which she said that her grandparents had 3 sons and 3 daughters. One of the sons was Paul or Pincus. There's the letter. There's Emil and Ada, and their sister Fania and her 2 daughters. Fania, her husband and children were murdered in the Holocaust. Ada survived, and Emil also escaped. Now, I'd discovered that record. Sorry for the darkness, it's my screen. I discovered that record on the 7th of June, and it was right before I was due to go to Israel. And I'd said to my friend in Israel, "I'm sure I've got family in Israel, but I just don't know how to trace them." Well, through that connection with Alan, he put me in touch with a family who put me in touch with my grandmother's second cousin, Rena. Rena was born Rena Rothenberg. And we met her in Tel Aviv that holiday. It was just incredible. I've not done a chart to show you how she's related. Trust me, though, she is. So 2 years later, I met Alan in London, and we got on like a house on fire. And we have got on ever so well ever since. And we've been doing some work together, really, on the family tree. And then we had a family reunion in 2018. Rena flew over from Israel, and we met with Rena's other cousin, Alicia, who's a cousin on her mum's side, her husband, Adam, and her son, Charles. Now, Alicia and Adam are both sole survivors in their family, Holocaust survivors. Adam sadly passed away last year, and I'll tell you a little bit more about them later. But this was just a lovely family reunion. So I went to Warsaw to speak at the IAJGS conference in 2018. I won't tell you who took this photograph, but only one person is in focus, and it's not me. So it must be somebody that really loves him a lot. So I was also the photographer at this conference, the main photographer, and that was a lot of fun. I'm sure you'll recognize some people in this image, including the chief rabbi of Poland, Michael Szudrek. The last day that I was in Poland, I was on my own for the first time. It was pouring with rain, and I was going back to my hotel to get ready to leave when I saw a military ceremony going on outside the hotel. So being a photographer, I threw everything down, grabbed my camera and started taking pictures. And then I was approached by this very official looking officer, and I thought, oh no, I'm in a foreign country. I'm taking photographs of soldiers. Maybe I'm not supposed to be. But it turned out that this was the general of the Warsaw Garrison Command, and he wanted to take a photo with me. I've absolutely no idea. I look like a drowned rat. And he wanted to put it on his website. Well, I wasn't too keen on that, but I let him take a picture anyway. And I had something up my sleeve. I thought, I'll send him the photograph when I get home, but I'm going to send him a bit more than the photograph, because my granddad was a member, was an officer in the Warsaw Garrison Command. So it wouldn't be a right story without telling you about my grandfather. My grandfather was not Jewish, he was Catholic. When I first came to talk in Warsaw, right before my talk actually, excuse me, I'm going to put the light on so you can see me a bit better. Michael came up to me before I was due to talk, and he says, Jenny, there's someone here who met your grandfather. I could not believe it. I'd never met anybody that had met my grandfather. It turned out it was Anthony Polonsky, as many of you will know, as an expert on Polish Jewish history. And I think he was the leading academic at that conference. And he said, yes, I met your grandfather at a house. We were together at a party or something in London. So how could I concentrate on my presentation after that? Turn this down. Sorry for that, messing around. So my grandfather, Mum said that he told her he was a marked man. He could never return to Poland. And through his military records, we discovered where he was buried. Well, my sister found his grave. I was on the phone to her at the time, and we both just cried. He was surrounded by elaborate graves of Polish generals and people like that. He had a good record himself. He was a highly decorated Polish officer. But all he had on his humble grave was political refugee. He did not live to see again his beloved country. So I found records for my grandfather from Warsaw University records, from the military archives. This is where we learned about all his medals. You'll remember that James said he also spent time with his aunt Helena and her husband. Her husband was a senator. Well, we found records for him in the Shem, the Polish treasury. He had been involved in the funeral of Marshal Józef Pilsudski, sorry for my Polish pronunciation, in Warsaw in 1935, which you can see is a huge state funeral. But one of the most remarkable things that my grandfather was involved in was arranging the silent march in London. His eulogy was given to the Polish government in exile, and it says for 4 years he stood at the head of the movement for Polish unity. It was at his particular insistence that the famous silent march took place as a sign of protest at the Soviet occupation of Poland during the visit of Bulganin and Khrushchev in London. This was the greatest and most successful effort of President Lis, of which he can be rightly proud. I was very proud of him. Over 20,000 people marched against communism, and he was the driving force behind that march. He's seen here in this newspaper cutting. He also worked with General Anders, which some of you will know. He was known as the Polish Moses. He led the people out of Stalin's slavery, if you like, in the gulags to British Mandate of Palestine. And then he formed, I'm sure, Robert Ostricharz, you can correct me, but I think it was the Polish Second Corps that he formed. He formed this army out of all these people who'd been deported and displaced. Just these photos of General Anders actually just came to light in my grandmother's belongings just last year. finally, on my grandfather, his whole life, it says, was tied to Poland. He was a patriot, but he was also, it seems he had an outstanding character. He was a very good man, a generous person, and very involved in social, political activity, you know, for people's good. The Warsaw Garrison Command, I said to you, I had another ulterior motive. I sent the general of the Garrison Command some papers, some of my grandfather's papers from his military records, and they asked me to put together an exhibition to celebrate his life, to be shown in Warsaw. It was supposed to be last year, to celebrate 100 years of Polish independence. He fought in the battle for independence. You know, he was nominated twice for the Virtuti Militari, that Poland's highest military award. So I put together this whole exhibition. This is my grandson. This is the final board holding his great-great-grandfather. But because of COVID, it wasn't shown, but it's ready to go. I've been told by the garrison, so maybe it will still be held. Now, I'm coming towards the end, but I want to mention some lockdown discoveries. Talking to Alan, there were some family traditions, I'm sure, in many Jewish families, there's these traditions that are passed down. One was that the family, the Rothenberg family, is connected to the Hacham Tzvi. And Alan wanted to see if there was any way that we could determine that. Also, this famous painting by Morrissey Gottlieb, Jews at Prayer on Yom Kippur, which was painted in 1878 of Drohobych Synagogue, where the Rothenberg family came from. Apparently, every single person in that photograph, was a relative of Alan's father, Emil. And, you know, Alan's mom has written here, you know, the man with the tallis is Dad's great-great-uncle Rothenberg, and she goes through. So I wanted to see if there was any way that we could find out if this was really true. So I began searching on JRI just to try and make the tree bigger. Karen had made a lovely tree, a brilliant tree, but I wanted to see if we could extend it out and find out where this connection was. So the first thing I noticed was a lot of babies called Aaron Hirsch. And you know that grandchildren are named after a deceased, very often named after a deceased grandparent. I've learned this mostly through talking to Michael, but I realized that all these babies that were born within a couple of years must be from branches of the same family. They must have the same grandfather, Aaron Hirsch. And I knew that Zindel, you recognize Zindel, that's Pincus's father. Aaron Hirsch was his father. So I thought they must be branches on this tree. So I then identified two more sisters, Amalia and Rachel. And it proved that it was through Amalia's marriage to Lipa Tiegemann. And Karen Franklin always thought that it was the Tiegemann connection because Morrissey Gottlieb, his mum, was called Felicia Tiegemann. So we're still not sure if Lipa was Felicia's brother. But what we do know is that Amalia and Lipa's sons, two sons, married two of Morrissey Gottlieb's sisters. So there was the connection. Another thing I found was that Rachel, the other sister, she had a son called Mechel Wolf. Mechel Wolf is a very common name in the Rothenberg family. His assimilated name was Wilhelm, and he was a photographer. He was known as the father of Polish photography, which was fantastic for me to find that out. And here's some of his images. He documented the Galician oil wells and took lots of portraits. And his son, Gustav Russ, was also a photographer and documented a lot of Jewish cemeteries in Poland. Finally, the last of these lockdown revelations was finding the family of Reuben Probst. And I was able to trace the wife of Kurt Weinbach, Sheila. And Sheila, I traced her during lockdown. And of course, Kurt, yeah, you can see here. So Kurt had a daughter called Rachel, and she had a son called Kurt. and they escaped. They were the last Jewish family, I think, to leave Austria. And they have a remarkable story, which you can find online. And so I communicated with Sheila, and she sent me a photograph of this briefcase. And she said this was the briefcase that they carried all their old photographs and documents with them from Europe to China, because they went from Austria to China, then to Israel, finally to the USA. They took photographs and documents rather than other things. And I'm compiling a list of the names of family members that were murdered in the Holocaust, our family relatives. And you can see here, there are 50 names on this list. The saddest thing about genealogy, I think, is when you find a family on Yad Vashem, you know, and the happiest thing is when you find a family that's survived because they went to America, or they got out and they went to Argentina. And so these names have mostly been compiled from Yad Vashem. So just to finish, you know, what responsibility, this discovery made me think, what responsibility do I have in my own generation? As a photographer, I was working on my degree at the time. I decided that I would document the Holocaust survivors, Alicia Adams, Malamed Adams, and Adam. And, you know, Adam has such a tragic and heartbreaking story, but he was such a lovely man. And to listen to a witness, Elie Wiesel said, is to become a witness. And having listened to Adam tell me his story, how he lost his entire family, how he survived living in a hole in the ground for 8 months in pitch black darkness. You know, you don't forget those kind of things, and it motivates you to tell others so that they never forget. And I tell Adam and Alicia's story wherever I go, and Charles, their son, and Alicia, their family to me. I also traced a friend of my grandmother's, seen here in this picture. Her name is Teresa Sonkovich. She was Catholic. She was a Polish princess. She was deported to Kazakhstan as a 10-year-old. Her father was killed in Katyn. And I found her living in Wales in a Polish home in Penrhos, traveled down to see her. And she remembered my grandmother and her sister as two beautiful Jewish girls from Lvov. I also did a project called From Generation to Generation, where I documented descendants of exiled Polish soldiers. This was the oldest Polish soldier in Scotland. He had the same birthday as my grandfather and came from the same town, Lvov. Sadly, he died not long after I took this photograph. He just turned 100. Here he is with his daughter, Patricia. And how humbling it was to meet with him. But in our generation, you know, because I'd started connecting with the Jewish community, I'd met with, I'd gone to the synagogue in Aberdeen where we live. Algorithms mean that you start getting things, you know, come up on your Facebook post. And one day, a picture of this little girl's bedroom came up on my Facebook page. She'd been murdered in her bedroom. She was only 13 years old. Her name was Hallel Yafa Ariel. And I decided I was going to write to her mum, because she was only killed because she was Jewish. And my heart went out to her, to her parents. So through contact in Israel, I wrote to her mum, Rina Ariel. And then I learned that there were many, many such victims in Israel. So I determined that I would try and tell their stories, because I couldn't see that they were being told in the UK or maybe anywhere else. Now, I ended up documenting 9 stories. I've just shown these 3 lovely ladies because I'm a mother and they are mothers that lost their children. You maybe will recognize Racheli Frankel. Her son, Naftali, was one of the 3 boys that was kidnapped by Hamas and found murdered just weeks later. Racheli is just lovely. I also met her in Scotland, and we correspond. And then Adva Bitten, her daughter, was the youngest victim that I documented. She was just 2 years old when a Palestinian rock throwing incident forced her mum's car under a lorry, a truck, and she was so severely injured, she never recovered from her injuries. Adva is also a friend of mine, and just such a lovely lady. These women had such grace, you know, choosing life. They told me that they choose life, but I couldn't help thinking, you know, that I knew that Hallel, this is Hallel, that her grandmother had jumped off the train from Treblinka as a teenager. She was the only one in her community to survive. She'd made it to Israel, where her daughter absolutely loved it. Granddaughter never wanted to leave. Racheli, her parents also fled Europe. I don't know about Adva. But the last person I want to speak about is Arnold Roth. And the reason I include Arnold is because when I wrote to him, his daughter Malki was 15 when she was murdered in the Sbarro pizza bombing in Jerusalem. And we've lots of Malki Rothenbergs in our tree, but I mentioned to Arnold that my grandmother's name was Rothenberg, and he said, so was my name, Rothenberg. His parents changed it. Both his parents were survivors, lost multiple family members in the Holocaust. And they came from the same part of Galicia as my Rothenbergs. And so Arnold and I met up in Jerusalem, and he told me that his mom used to dream of the streets of Jerusalem when she was, I think, in Auschwitz. And it was so tragic that her granddaughter lost her life in the streets of Jerusalem. Arnold's still fighting for justice for Malki. And he's just a lovely guy, very, very interested in genealogy as well. So I consider him a good friend. So I told these stories in an exhibition that my university held. Well, they invited me to hold actually in 2020, right before lockdown. Just to finish, last year in some old cardboard boxes, I imagine, in my cousin's home, my cousin found lots of my grandmother's possessions. We found her passport. That's so we now know how she fled Europe. She left in 1940, made her way through Austria to Rome, to France. There were some pictures of atrocities. We don't know whether they belonged to Irene or Helena or how they had them. But this was an insight into their lives, an insight into why my grandmother gave up her only child so that she could continue to fight for freedom. I finished my MA dissertation with these words: my grandmother's history, beginning in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, spanning countries and almost a century, was finally uncovered in America, buried in boxes in my cousin's home. And amongst these photographs that Sandy found was this one image. And when I pulled it out of the envelope she sent me, my eyes filled up. This is a picture of my mom. Her mother had kept it all these years. I recognize it as a photo my father had taken of my mom when she first met him and when she first met her parents. Now, if I'd not traced Sandy and Renata and they'd found this photograph, they would have had no idea who she was, that this was their father's first cousin. But to me, it was like coming full circle, this search to understand my mom. You know, I realized that she had her own search, she had her own struggle, but her mother had never forgotten her. And it was through circumstances completely out of her control that she'd not been able to keep her. This verse from the book of Isaiah, it just sums up how I feel about what I've done. Those from among you will rebuild the ancient ruins. You will raise up the age-old foundations of generations. You'll be called a repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets in which to dwell. Here's my cousin Renata with my grandmother Helena. And if you want to know more or read more about my story, you can find it online, www.fragmentsthatremain.co.uk. It's a work in progress, but you are welcome to have a look. Thank you for listening.
Jenny, thank you so much for this wonderful tour through your family history. I have a couple of questions which I will pass off. And Michael, I've also given you speaking capability. So if you plan on jumping in, feel free to do so. Just a word of introduction for those of you who don't know Michael. Michael has a list of credentials, too long. It would take up the whole time here. But suffice it to say that in addition to those things that Jenny mentioned, he's gotten a IAJGS Lifetime Achievement Award. He's been awarded the OBE by the Queen, co-founder of JRI Poland, vice president of the JGS of Greater Britain, and past vice president of programming at JewishGen, as well as many other things too numerous to mention. So now let me get to the questions. Okay, first of all, why do you think your grandmother or her family never tried to find your mother after the war, or why your mother never tried to find them?
Okay, well, that's a question I've obviously asked myself. Now, my mom was told that her mother didn't want her, but she did trace her mom when she was in her early 20s. And her mother, when she met her in a cafe, told her that she looked for her, but she couldn't find her. And I think that's very possible because she'd left her with a nurse in London who took her down to a baby's home in Devon. The baby's home then moved, and Mum's name was changed from Lis to Lister. Now, at the end of the Second World War, I don't know how quickly my grandmother would have been able to get away and go down to Devon and find this baby. I imagine if she tried hard enough, she could have done, and I have no idea why she didn't. She never told anybody that she had a baby until possibly very late in her life when she was senile. And my cousin Renata remembers her saying, somebody saying that Helena said she had a daughter. But I guess that's a question that we can't answer. I don't know. But when my mom met her, she said she loved meeting her mom. She obviously told her a lot about herself. And she was supposed to meet her again. They arranged to meet in a cafe. My grandmother lived in fear for the rest of her life. She was terrified that the Russians were going to come and take her. She wouldn't trust the Polish community in London. She wouldn't give an address. And so I think it made it hard for my mum to actually know where to reach her. So they'd arranged to meet in a cafe, and Mum says she got the day wrong. She went later, she went on the wrong day. And so they never had contact again.
Okay. What was the reaction of your siblings to finding out about their Jewish ancestry, and have any of you taken that Jewish ancestry a step further in terms of embracing Judaism or practicing of Judaism?
My siblings were all delighted to find out that they have Jewish ancestry. I think there were so many questions in my family anyway, and it was something that Mum always believed that was the reason, why she'd lost her family. She couldn't watch Schindler's List, for example, because she thought her family had been murdered in the Holocaust. And she always made us, really respectful of the Jewish people, that it was special. I think I got that from my mum, that it was special to be Jewish. So my siblings, without exception, were really pleased. Now we're all Christians. I became a Christian at the age of 17. So I've not embraced the Judaism as in the Jewish faith, but I do have a Jewish heritage, and I have embraced that, and I have embraced the Jewish people as my family and as my friends. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but yes,
thank you.
I'm delighted.
Okay. Are there any other questions that people would like to post? If so, yeah, okay. Not a question, but information. Someone has photographs from around the turn of the century, some from the Lower East Side in New York, some from Minsk, Babruysk, and Warsaw. Some he's identified, others not, but doesn't want to get rid of them. He's also waiting for documents from USCIS. And someone else says, I've gotten a few of these, which I'll pass along to you after the presentation, of comments about a wonderful presentation. I just want to remind everyone, someone asked if it's going to be posted. Yes, the audio will be posted in the member section of the JGSNY website. Just want to remind everybody that Jenny's handout can be downloaded from the link that you either got as a reminder for this meeting at about 1 o'clock Eastern time, or that you got from registering for the meeting if you registered after that. It'll also be sent out in tomorrow's thank you notice. Okay, I got several more questions now. Did you find any information about the woman who adopted your mother?
That's quite interesting, actually. My mum was brought up by this lady, Rose Toms, who I knew as my grandmother growing up. It was quite there was quite a lot of conflict in the relationship, actually, between Rose and Mum, because Mum found out later on that she hadn't actually adopted her. She'd been told that she was adopted, but she hadn't. She just looked after her, but she looked after her very, very well. My mum had private schooling, and Rose did everything she could. They were just very, very different personalities. She's actually been a very difficult person to trace herself. I know that she had her parents died when she was very young, and you know, that it's been very difficult to find out much about her. She was a trained nurse. She trained at Great Ormond Street, I think, in London. And my sister Anna is the one that's actually looking for more information about Rose. But yeah, she was a part of our family until her death. And Mum always acknowledged that she was the person that brought her up and, you know, helped her if she'd hurt herself and things like that. So yeah.
Okay. All right. A couple of questions about the Probst family. Did you find any information about the Probst family?
Well, through Sheila Weinbach, yes, I found out about Reuben, the family of Reuben Probst. And also somebody had emailed Michael. Michael, you might remember this, some time ago, with branches of the Probst family, of which my family is one branch. I do have that information if anybody is looking for information on the Probst family, but I haven't found cousins like I did with Alan yet. You know, I've only so much time to research, and I'm working on that actually at the moment.
Okay. Well, in the spreadsheet that I will send you, Charles Adams is asking for you to he's interested in tracing the Probst family, so he's including his contact information.
I'll send it to Charles.
Okay.
Sure.
All right. And also Faggy Stern is also interested in the Probst family. What insights into the Jewish people have you gotten ever since you realized that you were a member of the tribe?
Well, that's a really good question. I think I've got a lot of insights into the Jewish people, but I think, you know, one of the things that's really outstanding to me is, with everything that the Jewish people have been through, is their desire, you know, to continue and to choose life. Particularly, I felt that when I met the, you know, the families that had suffered from terrorism. That whole attitude was just so, I don't know how to put it into words. And also I feel that I've been embraced by the Jewish people in such a tremendous way. You know, being so encouraged, I feel like I've found a family. And yeah, there's lots of things that I could say, but it's been one of the best journeys of my life, I would say.
Interesting. Okay. I think one more call for questions. If there are no more questions, I will just again reiterate that the audio for this presentation will be posted in the members section on the JGSNY website sometime in the next few days, as soon as our webmaster gets to it. And also Jenny's handout can be downloaded from one or more of the various emails you have or will have gotten or will be getting over the next day or so. So again, thank you, Jenny. And now we'll let you go eat your dinner. Your supper. Excuse me.
Go get dinner. Yeah. Thank you to
Okay.
everybody that's
Okay,
tuned in.
thank you all for coming.
Appreciate
Bye-bye.
it. Thank you.